Every man Anita Nefemi had ever spent the night with was gone before she opened her eyes. Some left notes. One left coffee still warm. She told herself that was enough. They always left. That was just the pattern, the quiet tax of being a woman like her in rooms with men like them. So when she woke at 6:43 a.m. and heard movement in her kitchen, her first thought wasn't warmth. It was, something is wrong. She lay still for 3 full seconds, cataloguing. The sounds were unhurried, deliberate. The soft knock of a cabinet closing, water running briefly, then stopping. Not the sounds of someone leaving. The sounds of someone who had decided, without consulting her, to stay. She found him at her kitchen table. Yoon Mi-ho sat with the particular stillness of a man accustomed to occupying space without apology. He had found her small ceramic mugs, the ones her mother sent from Lagos, painted in indigo and rust, and set 2 of them on the table with a precision that suggested he'd noticed which shelf they were on and made a decision about it. He was still dressed, jacket folded over the back of the chair, sleeves pushed to the forearm. The tattoos that disappeared under his collar in the dark were visible now in the grey morning light, trailing up the inside of his left wrist like a map she didn't have the language to read. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He didn't smile, didn't offer an explanation. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her the night before, with a quiet, total attention that she still didn't have a category for, and said, "How do you take your coffee?" Anita stared at him. "We said one night," she said. "I know what we said. It's morning." "Yes." He waited, patient as a man who had already done the math and arrived somewhere she hadn't reached yet. "Coffee," she told him. She didn't know why she told him. Later, she would turn that moment over several times, looking for the version of herself that said, actually, "You need to leave." And she would find only the version that said 2 sugars, a little milk, and then stood in her own kitchen doorway, watching Yoon Mi-ho make her coffee like he'd decided overnight that this was something he intended to know how to do. He made it right. She didn't mention that. She sat across from him because the other option was to keep standing in the doorway, which felt worse. The table was small, the kind of table meant for one person who occasionally had company, not for 2 people sitting across from each other in the specific silence of an agreement that had already been quietly broken. His presence at it felt both wrong and, in a way she resented, not unwelcome. "You should go," she said, without urgency. It came out more like information than instruction. "Probably," he agreed. He wrapped both hands around his mug, large hands, she noticed again, the kind that made her ceramic cups look impractical, and looked at her with that same unreasonable steadiness. "I'll go." She waited. He didn't move. "Mi-ho, tell me something first." His voice was low, unhurried. In the daylight it was different than it had been in the dark, less a sound and more a presence, something she felt in her sternum before she fully processed the words. "Last night, when you said one night, was that what you wanted, or what you decided was reasonable to want?" The question landed somewhere unprotected. Anita set her mug down. She looked at him across her small table in her small kitchen in the grey light of a morning she hadn't planned, and she felt the question move through her like something cold and clarifying. And she did not answer it, because answering it would require a honesty she had not agreed to give him. "That's not a fair question," she said finally. "No," he agreed, "it's not." He stood then, unhurried, and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He was tall, she'd registered that the night before, but here, in the proportioned smallness of her kitchen, it was different. He crossed to where she sat and paused beside her, close enough that she could smell the faint cedar of whatever he wore, and she looked straight ahead at the wall, because looking up felt like conceding something. He set a card on the table beside her mug. Plain, a number, nothing else. "I don't do this," he said quietly. He set the card down with the same deliberateness he'd set her coffee cup, like a decision already made, not an impulse. "Now I do." She heard him move toward the door, heard the soft, final sound of it closing behind him, Anita sat alone in her kitchen for a long time after that, her mother's indigo mug warm between her palms, the card sitting on the table where he'd placed it. She didn't pick it up. She didn't throw it away either. She left the card on the table for 6 days, not because she forgot it was there. Anita Nifemi did not forget things, not appointments, not deadlines, not the specific weight of a question asked across a small kitchen table by a man who had no business still occupying space in her thoughts. She left it there deliberately, the way you leave a thing untouched to prove to yourself that you can. She ate breakfast around it, reviewed field research documents with it in her peripheral vision, called her mother on a Sunday evening, and watched it from the couch while her mother talked about her sister's new job, and the cousin who was getting married in Ibadan in the spring, and how Anita needed to rest more. She could hear tired in her voice all the way from Lagos. Anita said, "Yes, Ma," and "I'm fine, Ma," and kept her eyes on the card and said nothing about it because there was nothing to say. A man left his number. That was all. That was not all. On the 7th day, her colleague James stopped by her office to return a borrowed textbook and noticed she hadn't touched her lunch. "You're doing that thing," he said, settling uninvited into the chair across from her desk. "I'm working." "You're staring at your laptop without reading anything on it." He folded his arms. "That's not working. That's marinating." James Carter, an American researcher from Atlanta who'd landed at Yonsei the same year she had been her closest work friend for nearly 3 years, which meant he had accumulated an unreasonable amount of accurate information about her. She found this useful approximately half the time. "I'm fine," she said. "Who is he?" She looked up. He grinned. "It's always a he when you marinate this long." Anita closed her laptop. She considered briefly the version of this conversation where she said, "Nobody, forget it," and watched him believe her. Then she thought about 6 days of a card sitting on her kitchen table and decided she was tired of being sensible about it. "Someone I shouldn't have spent time with," she said carefully. James raised an eyebrow. "Married?" "No." "Dangerous." She paused one beat too long. "Anita." "It was one night. It's not a situation." She reopened her laptop. "I'm not calling him." James was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was choosing his words. "You know what your problem is," he said finally, not unkindly. "You decide what something is allowed to be before it has a chance to show you." She didn't answer that. He left 20 minutes later, and she sat in her office in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon and thought about a man who had sat at her kitchen table like he belonged there and asked her a question she still hadn't answered. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked it up again and typed, "You left your number. I'm not sure why I'm using it." She stared at it for a moment, then sent it before the sensible part of her could intervene. His response came in 4 minutes. "Because you wanted to." 3 words, no punctuation, delivered with the same unreasonable certainty he'd carried into her kitchen, into her morning, into the week she'd spent pretending he hadn't lodged himself somewhere she couldn't easily reach. She set the phone face down on her desk. It buzzed again. "Dinner, Friday. I'll send a car." Not an invitation, a statement, soft-edged but certain, the kind that expected a response without demanding one. She recognized the construction. It was the same language as "How do you take your coffee?" Not a question designed to give her an out, but one designed to tell her he'd already decided she was worth asking. She should say no. She built the no carefully, brick by brick, in the 30 seconds she sat with the phone face down. She was a woman who knew better. She'd learned better the hard way, with men who said, "I want you," and meant "I want this version of you, the one that's easy." She had a type, apparently, and her type historically had an expiration date. And she'd gotten very good at reading the signs early and making her exit before the cost got too high. The problem was, Miho didn't read like those men, and that, she understood with uncomfortable clarity, was exactly the danger. She turned the phone over, typed, "I'll meet you there, send the address." His response came in under a minute this time. An address in Gangnam, 40 minutes from her apartment, a neighborhood she had passed through but never eaten in. "There's a dish I want you to try." If you hate it, you can leave. If you hate it, she thought, not if you're uncomfortable or if this is too much. He was already giving her the exit, framing it around something small and manageable. Food, preference, a simple out that had nothing to do with him. It was almost thoughtful enough to be alarming. Almost. She put her phone in her bag and looked at her closed laptop and thought about James saying, "You decide what something is allowed to be before it has a chance to show you." She thought about a card she'd left on her table for 6 days. She thought about a question she still hadn't answered. Friday, she told herself. She would go on Friday, and she would eat whatever he wanted her to try, and she would be smart about it, careful, clear-eyed, no expectations carried in like contraband. She knew how to do that. She'd had years of practice at wanting things quietly, at keeping the wanting from showing on her face. What she hadn't had practice at was a man who seemed to already know anyway. "Hi fam, welcome to Afro-Korean Series channel. I'm glad you're here." Anita had lived in Seoul for 3 years and had learned, slowly and without bitterness, that she was always going to be looked at. Not always unkindly, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with the particular fascination of people encountering something outside their frame of reference. She had developed a relationship with it, the glances on the subway, the occasional double take, the way conversations sometimes paused when she entered a room. She was a tall Nigerian woman with natural hair and a public health research position at Yonsei University. And she moved through Seoul the way she moved through most things, with her chin level and her expectations managed. She had not until Friday evening walked into Gangnam beside Yoon Mi-ho. The restaurant didn't have a sign she could read from the street. The entrance was a single black door set into a stone facade, flanked by 2 men whose stillness she recognized immediately. Not employees, not hosts. She filed that away without reacting to it. Mi-ho appeared from inside before she reached the door, and something in the way the men stepped back when he moved told her everything the unmarked entrance hadn't. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across her kitchen table, total, unhurried. And then he said, "You came?" "I said I would." People say things. He held the door. "You did it." Inside was warm and low lit, the kind of deliberate intimacy that cost money without announcing it. The room was small, maybe 8 tables, all occupied by people who glanced up when Mi-ho entered, and then looked away with the practiced disinterest of people who knew better than to stare. Several of them noticed her. She felt it, the register of her presence moving through the room like a current. And she kept her face neutral and her shoulders back, and told herself it was no different from the subway. It was slightly different from the subway. Mi-ho guided her to a table in the far corner with his hand at the small of her back. Light, deliberate, not a grip but a direction. And she was aware of every eye that tracked the movement. He pulled her chair before she reached for it and sat across from her with the ease of a man entirely unbothered by the room's attention. "They're staring," she said quietly, once they were seated. "Yes." He poured water into her glass first. "Does it bother you?" "Does it bother you?" He looked up at her. "No." It was such a simple answer. No qualification, no reassurance, no performance of not caring. Just, no. She turned it over for a moment and found she didn't know what to do with it. So she picked up the menu and discovered it was entirely in Korean. "Order for me," she said. "But if I hate it, I'm leaving." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the territory a smile might someday occupy. "You won't hate it," he ordered in Korean, speaking to the server with the same quiet authority he brought to everything. And then he turned back to her, and the server disappeared, and it was just the 2 of them in the corner of a room full of people pretending not to watch. "How long have you been in Seoul?" he asked. 3 years. "You speak Korean?" It wasn't a question. She'd used 2 words with the server, 감사합니다, automatic, polite, and he'd caught it. "Enough," she said. "Not fluently." He nodded slowly. Then, in Korean, low enough that only she could hear. "You're more comfortable here than you let people see." She understood it, all of it. She chose to answer in English. "That's a presumptuous thing to say to someone you've spent one night with." "One night and a Friday," he corrected, unbothered. The food arrived in stages. Small dishes first, banchan arranged with care, then a clay pot set between them that released steam, carrying the smell of something fermented and deep and extraordinarily good. Doenjangjigi, she would learn later. Soybean, paste stew, the kind Korean mothers made, the kind that meant home to people for whom it meant home. He watched her try it with the same attention he gave everything. "Well," he said. "I'm not leaving," she said. This time he did smile, brief, real, there and then gone. But she caught it and felt it settle somewhere inconvenient. They ate in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable, broken by him naming dishes when she pointed, occasionally switching to Korean when the English didn't carry the right weight, switching back without explanation. She noticed he did it when something mattered. The language shift a tell she didn't think he knew he had. She filed it away. It was over the second cup of barley tea that he said, without preamble, "There are people who won't like that you're here with me." She set her cup down. "Your people or mine?" "Both, probably." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know I'm aware of that. And I'm here anyway." A pause. "So are you." Anita looked at him across the table, at this man who commanded rooms without trying, whose stillness carried weight she still didn't fully understand, who had broken their agreement and made her coffee, and sent 3 words that she'd spent a week trying to unknow. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safe. She wasn't naive enough to call it safe. Chosen. She felt chosen. And that, she was beginning to understand, was the more dangerous thing. Outside, through the restaurant's single narrow window, Seoul moved the way it always did, relentless, illuminated, indifferent. Inside, Miho refilled her tea without asking, and she let him, and neither of them mentioned what that meant. The second dinner happened without being planned. Anita had gone to the covered market near Hongdae on a Saturday morning, the way she always did, alone, early, before the weekend crowds thickened the narrow aisles into something unnavigable. She had a route, vegetables first, then the stall with the imported ground nut oil the owner kept for her without being asked, then the small bakery at the far end that made a coconut bread that wasn't quite like her mother's, but was close enough to be comforting. She was standing at the vegetable stall, debating between 2 bunches of scallions with the focused energy she usually reserved for research decisions, when she became aware of someone beside her. She didn't startle. She wasn't sure why. She should have. But something in her peripheral vision had already registered the particular quality of his stillness before her conscious mind caught up. Miho stood beside her in the market aisle in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, looking at the scallions with the same serious attention she was giving them. "You're following me," she said, not a question. "I'm shopping," he said. She looked at him. He looked at the scallions. She looked back at the scallions. "You don't cook," she said. "How do you know that?" "You ordered for both of us on Friday, and you didn't cook anything yourself. Men who cook talk about it." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite amusement, not quite surprise. The territory between the two. "I cook," he said simply. "I just don't talk about it." She bought both bunches of scallions because she couldn't decide, and Miho fell into step beside her without being invited. She didn't ask him to leave. She wasn't sure what that said about her, and decided not to examine it in a vegetable market on a Saturday morning. He was quiet in the way she was learning was specific to him. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but someone who chose carefully what to spend words on. He noticed things without commenting on them. When a stall owner's eyes lingered on her with the particular curiosity she knew well, Miho shifted almost imperceptibly. Half a step closer, his shoulder angling between her and the gaze, not blocking her, but present in a way that changed the geometry of the moment. He didn't announce it. She didn't think he even knew he'd done it. She thought about it for the rest of the aisle. At the bakery, she ordered her coconut bread and ordered one for him without thinking. He accepted it without comment, turned it in his hands, took a bite with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. "It's not quite right," she said before he could. "The texture. My mother's is denser." "What does she put in it?" "Evaporated milk, and she lets it prove longer than the recipe says." She paused, surprised she'd said that much. "She's particular about bread." "My grandmother was particular about rice," he said. "The water level. She measured it with her finger. First knuckle above the rice. Said measuring cups were for people who didn't trust themselves." It was the most he'd said about himself in one breath since she'd met him. She didn't point that out. She took a bite of her bread and let the moment settle without pressing it. They ended up at a pojangmacha at the edge of the market, a small tent stall with plastic stools and a gas burner, and an elderly woman who clearly knew Miho well enough to start preparing without being asked. Anita watched the exchange with interest. "You come here often," she said, "when I need to think." "What do you think about?" He looked at her across the small plastic table. "Lately." She held his gaze. "Don't answer that if it's going to be smooth." His mouth curved, that almost smile again, brief and real. "It wouldn't be smooth." He wrapped both hands around the paper cup the woman set in front of him. "I think about things that don't have clean answers." "And? Am I one of them?" "You're the reason I'm still looking." The woman set a plate of iomuk between them, fish cake skewers, warm and simple, and Anita took one because she'd learned in 3 years that refusing food at a pojangmacha was a specific kind of rudeness. Miho watched her try it with that same quiet attention he'd given the doenjang jjigae. "You've been careful," she said, after a moment. "Not an accusation, an observation." "About what?" "About what you tell me, about yourself." She kept her voice neutral. "You ask questions, you don't answer many." He was quiet for a beat. Outside the tent, the market moved around them, Seoul in full Saturday motion, and inside it was just the two of them, and a gas burner and a plate of fish cake going slowly cool. "What do you want to know?" he said finally. She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. There were things she could ask, obvious things her instincts had already begun to circle without landing on. The men at the restaurant door, the way rooms reorganized around him, the terse phone call he'd stepped away to take on the walk back through the market, speaking in a register she'd never heard him use, low and flat and entirely different from the voice he used with her. She could ask about all of it. "Not yet," she said instead. He looked at her. "When you're ready to tell me something real," she said quietly, "I'll be ready to hear it. Until then," she picked up another skewer. "I'm enjoying the fish cake." Miho looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something that moved through careful and arrived somewhere that looked, briefly and unexpectedly, like relief. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He picked up a skewer, and they sat together in the tent while Seoul moved loudly past them, and Anita told herself she was still being careful. She told herself that right up until he walked her to her building an hour later, and she realized she'd told him which street she lived on without noticing she'd done it. She stood at her door and turned to find him already 2 steps back, giving her space, she understood, before she'd asked for it. "Same time next Saturday," he said. She almost said this wasn't planned. She almost said, "I don't know what we're doing." She almost said a lot of sensible things that would have been true and useful and would have cost her something she wasn't sure she wanted to spend. "I'll be at the scallion stall by 9, she said instead. He nodded once, turned and walked back into the Seoul evening without looking back. She went inside and stood in her hallway for a moment, scallions in one hand, half a coconut bread in the other, and thought about a man who shifted his shoulder between her and a stranger's gaze without announcing it. She thought about that for a long time. The 3rd Saturday came and went, and then a 4th. By the 5th, Anita had stopped pretending the scallion stall was incidental. She was there by 8:50, which she told herself was because she'd woken early, and not because she'd been awake since 6, thinking about whether he would come. He was already there when she arrived. leaning against the stall's wooden post with his phone in his hand, not looking at it, watching the market entrance with the patient attention of a man who had decided waiting was not an inconvenience, but a choice. He saw her before she reached him. Something in his posture shifted. Almost nothing. The kind of change you'd miss if you weren't already paying the specific attention she had apparently begun paying without authorizing herself to. "You're early," she said. "So are you," he said. They walked the market the way they had developed without discussing it. Her route, her stalls, him beside her carrying whatever she bought with the natural ease of someone who had decided this was his function and found no conflict in it. The ground nut oil vendor greeted her in Korean now and glanced at Miho with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to be careful around him. Miho exchanged a few words with him, easy, brief, and the man's shoulders dropped half an inch. "What did you say to him?" Anita asked as they moved on. "That the oil was good quality. That's all. And that you'd been a regular for 2 years and deserved the good stock, not what he puts out front." She stopped walking. He took 2 more steps before registering she'd stopped and turned back to look at her with that unreasonable patience. "You can't just," she started. "It's already done," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment, caught between irritation and something warmer that she didn't want to name in a market aisle on a Saturday morning. "Miho." "Nifemi," he said. First time he'd used her middle name. He said it correctly, the syllables landing in the right places, the slight lift at the end, and she felt it move through her like something she hadn't braced for. "You practiced that," she said. "Several times." No apology, no performance of casualness, just the fact of it, offered plainly. She turned and kept walking because standing still felt suddenly insufficient. They were at the Pojangmacha, their Pojangmacha. She didn't examine when it had become that, when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, and something in his face went very still in the specific way she'd begun to recognize, not the stillness of calm, the stillness of control being applied. "I need to take this," he said. "Go ahead." He stepped outside the tent, and she watched through the gap in the plastic sheeting as he moved 10 feet away, turned his back, and answered. She couldn't hear the words. She could hear the register, that flat, low tone, entirely different from his voice with her, the one that made the air feel different. The call lasted 4 minutes. When he came back, his face had resettled, but his jaw carried something tight that hadn't been there before. He sat, picked up his cup, said nothing. She let the silence run for a moment. Then, "Is everything all right?" "Yes." She looked at him. "No," he amended quietly. "But it will be handled." It was the most honest thing he'd said about his world since she'd met him, and she understood it was costing him something to say even that much. She didn't push. She picked up her Eomuk skewer and looked out at the market and gave him the space she'd learned he needed to find his way back from wherever those calls took him. After a while he said, in Korean, "You never ask." She answered in Korean carefully. "You'll tell me when it matters." He looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that moved through careful and arrived somewhere that looked like relief, like a man repeatedly, surprised to find something where he expected nothing. "My father called a dinner," he said, in English now, deliberate, she'd learned, Korean for intimacy, English for facts. He needed her to receive clearly. "Next Friday, family. He wants to meet." A pause, brief, and waited. "The people currently in my life." Anita set her skewer down. "How many people is that?" "1. The word sat between them on the plastic table, with the weight of everything they hadn't said yet. She understood what he was asking. She understood also what it cost a man like him to ask it. Not the words, which were few, but the exposure underneath them. Bringing her to a family dinner wasn't dinner. It was a declaration. In his world, in his culture, in the specific social architecture of who Yoon Mi-ho was, it was him placing her somewhere visible and refusing to apologize for it. She thought about the restaurant in Gangnam, the room reorganizing around his entrance, the men at the door. She thought about his shoulder shifting between her and a stranger's gaze. She thought about several times, said without apology, about the way he'd learned her name in her own language and offered it back to her like something he'd been careful with. "What would I be walking into?" she asked. "My father is traditional, my mother is," he considered, "perceptive. There are 2 younger brothers who will behave because I will ask them to." A pause. "It will not be easy." "But you're asking anyway." "I'm asking anyway." Anita looked at this man across a small plastic table in a market tent in Seoul. This dangerous, careful, quietly relentless man who had broken their agreement and learned her name and shifted his body between her and the world's gaze without once asking for credit. And she felt the thing she'd been managing since a Friday morning with 2 ceramic mugs on her kitchen table. It wasn't safe. She'd known that from the beginning, but he kept showing up, and she was beginning to understand that was its own kind of answer. "Tell me what to wear," she said. She watched him absorb it, the stillness breaking for just a moment, something unguarded passing through before the composure returned. She filed it away carefully, like something fragile. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, just for a moment, just long enough to be intentional, and then withdrew it. "Something you feel like yourself in," he said. "Nothing else." Outside, Seoul moved through its Saturday. Inside the tent, Anita turned her paper cup in her hands and thought about a family dinner she hadn't agreed to yet, and somehow already had. She wore the green, not because it was safe. It wasn't, particularly. A deep Ankara print wrap dress her mother had sent from Lagos 8 months ago, with a note that said, "For when you have somewhere worthy to wear it." Anita had hung it in her wardrobe and not touched it because nowhere in Seoul had felt worthy yet, and she hadn't wanted to examine what that meant. She touched it on Friday evening and thought, here, then. Miho's car arrived at 7. Not a message, not a reminder, just the car. Exactly when he'd said. A dark sedan with a driver who opened her door without being asked and didn't speak on the 40-minute ride to a residential neighborhood in Seongbuk-gu that felt quieter and older than the Seoul she moved through daily. The houses here had walls, real ones, stone and plaster, not the glass and steel of Gangnam, the kind of walls that had been standing long enough to mean something. The driver stopped at a gate. Miho was on the other side of it. He saw her and went still in the specific way she'd catalogued by now. The full stop, the complete attention. His gaze moved over the dress once, unhurried, and when it returned to her face, something had settled in it that hadn't been there before. "Your mother sent it," he said. Not a question. She stared at him. "How could you possibly know that?" "The print, and the way you're wearing it, like it means something." He held the gate. "It's right." She walked through without answering because there was nothing to say to a man who read her that accurately on a Friday evening outside his family home. The house inside the walls was traditional in its bones. A hanok, low and deliberate, with a wooden veranda wrapping the inner courtyard where paper lanterns had been lit against the evening dark. It was beautiful in a way that felt private, not performative. The kind of beautiful that wasn't for guests. She understood immediately that being here was not a small thing. Miho's hand found the small of her back as they crossed the courtyard. The same light, deliberate placement as Gangnam, except here it felt different. Here it was legible. Anyone watching would know exactly what it meant, and she was fairly certain someone was watching. She was right. His mother appeared in the doorway before they reached the veranda steps. Yoon Soo-yeon was a small woman who carried herself like a much larger one. She looked at Anita with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who had raised a man like Miho and was therefore not easily impressed or easily fooled. The assessment lasted 3 seconds. Then she stepped back and gestured them inside with a phrase Anita's Korean was good enough to catch. "Come in, you'll be cold." Not welcome, not lovely to meet you. Just Come in. Anita decided she respected that. The dinner table held 6. Miho's father sat at the head, a broad, quiet man with Miho's stillness and none of his warmth, who greeted Anita with a formal nod and spoke to her in careful, deliberate English that told her he'd prepared for this. Across from her, Miho's 2 younger brothers, Junho, 26, who smiled too easily to be trusted, and Siwon, 23, who stared at his plate with the focused energy of someone who'd been told to behave and was finding it difficult. The food came in waves. Soo-yeon moved between kitchen and table with the efficiency of a woman who cooked as a form of authority, setting dishes down without explanation. Anita recognized some of it. 3 weeks of Saturday markets had given her a working vocabulary of Korean food. She recognized the galbi, the japchae, the kimchi that smelled older and deeper than anything she'd bought from a stall. She ate without hesitation. She'd learned that much, Junho noticed. "You know what everything is," he said, in English, gesturing at the table with mild surprise. "Most people ask." "I live in Seoul," she said. "I'd have starved by now, if I was nervous about food." Siwon made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Miho, beside her, said nothing, but his hand, beneath the table, found her knee briefly, once, grounding, and withdrew. She kept her face neutral and reached for her water. The conversation moved the way family dinner conversations did, around things as much as through them. Miho's father asked about her research in careful English. She answered clearly, without shrinking, and watched him recalibrate slightly when she cited her publication record. Soo-yeon, from the kitchen doorway, listened without pretending she wasn't. It was Soo-yeon who finally sat, halfway through the meal, and looked at Anita directly. "Your family is in Nigeria," she said, statement, not question. "My mother, yes. You miss her. Every day." Something shifted in Soo-yeon's face, brief, real. "My son," she began, then stopped, looked at Miho. Something passed between them that Anita couldn't read, fast and private, the language of people who knew each other's silences. Miho said quietly, in Korean, "I know, Ioma." Soo-yeon looked back at Anita. Whatever she'd been going to say had been replaced by something simpler. "Eat more," she said. "You haven't tried the japchae." It wasn't acceptance. Anita wasn't naive enough to call it that. But it was something. The door left slightly open by a woman who didn't open doors easily, and Anita understood the value of that without needing it named. After dinner, Miho walked her to the waiting car through the courtyard, while his family remained inside. The lanterns were lower now, the evening fully dark. He stopped at the gate and turned to face her. "You didn't shrink," he said. "I don't do that." "I know." A pause. "I wanted you to know that I know." She looked at him in the lantern light. This man who had brought her inside his walls, literally and otherwise, and stood beside her at his family table, without apology or explanation, and felt something she'd been carefully not feeling for weeks move through her with the quiet force of something that had been waiting for permission. "Miho," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then opened the gate. She walked through. In the car on the way back through Seoul, she looked out the window at the city moving past and thought about a dress her mother had sent for somewhere worthy and the specific weight of a hand on her knee beneath a family dinner table, and a door left slightly open by a woman who didn't open doors easily. She thought, "Oh," and then quietly, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been careful for a very long time, "Oh no." The email arrived on a Tuesday. Anita saw it between a research meeting and lunch, the subject line sitting in her inbox with the particular weight of something that had been inevitable and had chosen its moment poorly. Senior research position, final offer. The Global Health Organization in Geneva. The role she had spent a decade building toward, quietly and without fanfare, the way she built most things. They had extended the deadline once already. They wouldn't extend it again. She had 14 days. She closed her laptop and sat in her office in Yonsei's research building and listened to Seoul move outside her window and thought about 14 days with the focused stillness of someone trying not to feel the full weight of a thing before they were ready. James found her an hour later, still sitting with her laptop closed. "That's the closed laptop face," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Not the marinating face, the other one." "There's a difference. Marinating is passive, that," he pointed, "is active, not dealing." He folded his arms. "What happened?" She told him about Geneva, not about Miho. She wasn't ready to say those two things in the same sentence yet. Just Geneva, the deadline, the 14 days. James listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he understood the weight of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want to do?" "I don't know." "Yes, you do." She looked at him. "You've wanted that position since before Seoul," he said, not unkindly. "That hasn't changed just because Seoul got complicated." A pause. "Has it?" She didn't answer. He didn't push. He left 20 minutes later with the particular tact of a man who knew when his presence had become an obstacle to thinking. She opened her laptop and read the email 3 times and then closed it again. She didn't tell Miho that night. They had fallen into a pattern. Tuesday evenings, his choice of location, always somewhere in the city that felt like a different layer of Seoul than she accessed on her own. A traditional tea house in Insadong, a rooftop pojangmacha in Mapo, a bookshop in Bukchon that stayed open late and smelled like paper and cedarwood, and where he'd pulled a Korean poetry collection from a high shelf and read her 2 lines without explanation, in Korean, and then shelved it again like he hadn't just done something that would stay with her for days. Tonight was a small restaurant in Ikseondong, narrow alleys, hanok conversions, the kind of soul that existed underneath the glossy surface of it. He was already there when she arrived. He always was. He looked at her once and said nothing, which was how she knew he saw it. They ordered, they ate. She told him about a colleague's funding dispute that had consumed her week, and he listened with his full attention the way he always did. And she thought about Geneva sitting in her inbox like an unanswered question and said nothing about it. It was over the last of the macchioli that he said, quietly, "Something is wrong. I'm fine, Anita." Her name in his mouth, her first name, the one he used when he needed her to stop performing, landed the way it always did. She set her cup down. "I received a job offer," she said, "in Geneva, senior position. It's something I've wanted for a long time." He was still. The particular quality of his stillness had become readable to her by now. This one wasn't the stillness of calm. It was the stillness of a man receiving information and not allowing his first reaction to be his visible one. "When do they need an answer?" he said. 14 days. He nodded slowly, looked at his cup. Then, "Is it what you want?" "It was," she said. "Before?" "Before what?" She looked at him across the small table in the narrow restaurant in Ikseondong and thought about everything she'd been carefully not saying for weeks, about Saturday mornings at a scallion stall, about a hand on her knee beneath a family dinner table, about a man who had learned her name in her own language and offered it back like something he'd been careful with. "Before Seoul got complicated," she said. James's words. They fit. Miho looked at her for a long moment. "I won't ask you to stay," he said. "I know. That's not—" He stopped, started again, carefully. "I need you to understand that. Not asking you to stay is not the same as wanting you to go." Something in her chest tightened. "Then what is it?" "It's—" He looked away briefly, the way he did when English wasn't carrying the right weight, and she waited while he found his way back. "It's knowing that what you want should cost you nothing. That you shouldn't have to choose between a life you built and—" He stopped again. "And," she said quietly. He looked at her directly. "And something still becoming." The restaurant was quiet around them. Seoul hummed, distantly outside the alley. She sat with his words and felt them settle into the specific places they were meant for. the ones she'd been guarding since a morning with 2 ceramic mugs and a card she hadn't thrown away. "Miho," she said, "there's something I haven't told you." He waited. "The offer came 3 months ago. I asked them to extend the deadline, twice." She held his gaze. "I've been here in Seoul, telling myself I was deciding about a job." A pause. "I wasn't deciding about the job." Something shifted in his face. Not the composed crack she'd catalogued before, but something deeper, something that moved through him slowly, like a change in weather. "What were you deciding?" he said, low, careful. She had built the answer over weeks without knowing she was building it. It was ready before she was. "Whether you were real," she said. "Whether this was real. Whether I was allowed to want something that scared me this much." She hadn't planned to say that much. She felt the exposure of it settle over her like something she couldn't take back, and found surprisingly that she didn't want to. The silence between them held the weight of everything that had been moving toward this moment since a Friday morning when she'd found him at her kitchen table with 2 ceramic mugs and no intention of leaving. He reached across the table, not her knee this time, her hand fully, his fingers closing around hers with the deliberate certainty of a man who had also been deciding something and had arrived at his answer before she'd asked the question. "I'm real," he said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't smooth. It was simply the truth, offered plainly by a man who chose his words carefully and meant every one. She turned her hand over beneath his, let her fingers close back. Outside, Ikseondong moved through its Tuesday evening, indifferent and illuminated. Inside, Anita sat across from Yoon Mi-ho with her hand in his, and 14 days, sitting in her inbox, and thought that the most frightening thing about him had never been his world, or his stillness, or the men who stood at unmarked doors. It was this, the way he made staying feel like it could be hers, not a sacrifice, not a resignation, a choice that belonged entirely to her. She hadn't felt that in a very long time. The Geneva email sat in her drafts for 4 days. Not the rejection. She hadn't written that yet. Not the acceptance either. Just a blank reply with the organization's address in the to field and a cursor that blinked with the patience of something that knew it would eventually be filled. She opened it every morning and closed it every morning and went to work and came home and stood in her kitchen where 2 ceramic mugs sat on the shelf her mother had sent from Lagos, and thought about a choice that was beginning to feel less like a crossroads and more like a mirror. On the 4th day, Miho came to her apartment for the first time since the morning he'd broken their agreement. She hadn't invited him. He'd messaged at 7 in the evening, "I'm outside," with the same plain certainty he brought to everything, and she'd buzzed him up without deciding to because her hand had moved before she'd finished thinking about it. He came in carrying 2 containers from a restaurant she didn't recognize and set them on her kitchen table, her small table, the one meant for one person, and began opening them with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided feeding her was a reasonable response to whatever was happening. "You haven't eaten," he said. "How do you know that?" He looked at her once. She didn't ask again. She sat. He sat across from her. Between them he'd set out doenjang jjigae, the same dish from their first dinner, she realized. And she wasn't sure if that was deliberate, or if it simply was, and the meaning was hers to make of it. There was also jollof rice from a West African restaurant she'd mentioned once, weeks ago, in passing, while talking about something else entirely. She looked at it. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember everything you say," stated simply, without drama. The way he said most true things. She picked up her spoon and thought about a man who had agreed to one night and then sat at this table and asked how she took her coffee and had not, in all the weeks since, once made her feel like a variable in someone else's equation. "I'm not taking the Geneva position," she said. He looked up. "I made the decision this morning." She met his gaze steadily. "I want you to know it had nothing to do with you." He was still. "That's not—" She stopped, found the right words. "What I mean is, it wasn't a sacrifice. I've been using Geneva as a measuring stick for what I deserve for so long that I forgot to ask if I still wanted it. I want the work. I don't want Geneva." A pause. There are other positions. Better ones, possibly. I've been too focused on the one I almost lost to see them. Miho looked at her for a long moment. You're certain? I'm certain. Because I need you to know. Miho, she said it gently. I know. That's why I'm telling you. Because I need you to know it's mine. The decision is mine. Something moved through him. She watched it travel, slow and tectonic, from his jaw to his shoulders, to the hands that had been flat on the table and now weren't quite. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, open in a way his face rarely allowed itself, the composure present, but no longer the whole story. There's something I need to tell you, he said. She waited. The organization. My organization. He said it carefully, the first time he'd named it directly. I've been ending it. For 2 years. Moving people out, closing operations, building something that doesn't require, he paused, what it currently requires of me. He looked at her steadily. It's nearly done. 3 months, possibly 4. She absorbed this. You've been dismantling your own empire. Quietly. Why are you telling me now? Because you just made a decision that was entirely yours and told me so. Something in his voice shifted, lower, more direct. I want what I'm building to be something you can stand inside without cost. I want you to know what you're standing inside. The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, Seoul moved through its evening, distant and illuminated, and entirely indifferent to 2 people sitting at a small table with 2 kinds of food between them, deciding something that had no clean name yet. 3 months, she said. Perhaps 4. And then? He looked at her, the way he'd looked at her across every table they'd shared, with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had decided she was worth every moment of it. Then I'm just a man, he said, with considerably fewer complications. She felt the warmth of it move through her, not the consuming heat of something reckless, but the steadier warmth of something that had been built carefully, week by week, Saturday by Saturday, across small tables and market aisles, and a family dinner, and a Tuesday evening in Ikseondong, when she'd finally said the true thing out loud. I'm going to need you to understand something, she said. Tell me. I don't wait well. I'm not built for it. I overthink and I self-protect, and when I'm scared I go quiet in ways that can look like I've decided something I haven't. She held his gaze. So if the next 3 months get difficult, I need you to show up, not fix it. Just show up. He reached across the table, her hand this time, directly, no hesitation, no calculation. His fingers closed around hers with the same deliberate certainty as Ikseondong, except here in her kitchen, with her mother's mugs on the shelf and jollof rice on the table. It felt different. It felt like something with a future in it. I've been showing up, he said, since the morning you told me to leave and I made coffee instead. She laughed, real and sudden, the kind that arrives before you decide to let it. She felt it loosen something in her chest that had been held carefully for longer than she wanted to admit. You were insufferable that morning, she said. You kept the card. I kept the card, she agreed. He held her hand against his chest for a moment, his eyes on hers, then set it down without releasing it. Outside, Seoul did what Seoul always did. Inside, Anita sat in her kitchen across from a man who had broken every rule he'd agreed to and built something in the breaking that she hadn't known she was waiting for, and thought about her mother's note. For when you have somewhere worthy to wear it, and understood finally that worthy wasn't a place, it was this, being chosen clearly by someone who knew exactly what choosing her cost and had done it anyway. She picked up her spoon. The jollof is going cold, she said. Miho picked up his own spoon, unhurried, and the corners of his mouth did the thing she'd catalogued from the very beginning. The territory a smile occupied before it became one. Then we should eat, he said. And they did. Thanks for listening to the end. If you'd like more Afro-Korean romance stories like this, feel free to subscribe. So, What do you think of Anita and Miho's story? I'd like to hear your thoughts.